Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, so we want to do something today that is a little irresponsible, which is to tackle a huge topic in just a kind of a surface way, in just an hour. I would say, and I guess what I mean to say is we won't tackle it. This is really, we will just scratch the surface of something, but it's coming up in the order of learning that we've planned, sort of moving through the Seder Mishnah, the order of the Mishnah, and noting the important text. So this is coming up, and we should deal with it, but we will only begin today, and it's a topic that we should keep thinking about. I would say that the two most important movements in Judaism in the 20th century are Zionism and feminism. And I'm not sure which is more important, but those seem to me the two, certainly in the diaspora. Feminism, I would say, is the movement that has most transformed Jewish life and conversation. So much so, I mean, right, Zionism has done a lot too, started a whole state and everything. But in our context, we could point to, there are women rabbis, and there are lots of ways in which feminism has had a commentary and a critique and an offering and a challenge for what we think of as traditional Judaism. Like, feminism is there to change a more traditional version of Judaism. But that's actually one of the questions that I want us to be asking today is there some traditional non-egalitarian Judaism? That's the word we're going to be thinking about today, is egalitarianism. And that in some ways is a great reference point, because it has come to define a certain kind of Jewish practice. In fact, come to define in the sense that it is the defining or dividing line between often Orthodox and conservative Judaism, but more to the point, between a kind of Jewish practice that is traditional in the sense that it sees itself rooted in the tradition that goes back to the Torah, but distinguished in this particular sense. That is, when someone speaks of a traditional egalitarian minyan, which you'll hear that phrase, part of what they're saying is it's a minyan that is following Jewish law in every way that you would expect, but it is distinguished in that there is another group that will also see itself as carrying out the prayer in accordance with Jewish law, except that will be a non-egalitarian space, right? So egalitarianism, as a kind of manifestation of a feminist sensibility in Judaism, seems to be a kind of a departure. Like, oh, we accept the legitimacy of tradition, but except for with one big tweak, right? That's the way it often appears to us, and I will say that actually that's the way I have just mostly experienced it. I grew up with a non-egalitarian Jewish practice and was trained in one. I trained in Orthodox yeshivas, and then over time, I think I came to be convinced that this was an important and reasonable and necessary change to what I considered a kind of more traditional version of Judaism. But as we'll see today, one of the main questions I want to ask is, where do we get the idea that non-egalitarianism is traditional? I want to say something that's a little provocative and maybe not entirely accurate, but there is a sense in which the Torah is egalitarian. That is, or the Torah defaults towards egalitarianism in the way that we're talking about it now, which is to say, the Torah is a document that emerges out of patriarchal context. I mean, literally, like patriarchs running families. We could say it was sexist in all kinds of ways. And we could point to all kinds of mitzvot that very clearly gender obligations, like some that are explicitly related to biological sex, like menstruation laws, but some that are just assigned to one gender, like all of your males shall appear before the Lord on the 3 pilgrimage festivals. So those things exist in the Torah, and we could talk about them, and in a way they're a part of this conversation. But in another way, I want to say that's not going to be our concern at the moment, because the more, in some ways, like glaring legal reality that the Torah presents is one that presumably applies to all Israelites, men and women, right? And that is the default assumption, that though the Torah will often speak in the to the male reader and in the gender of a man, that all of the laws, unless otherwise specified, are intended for men and women to be obligated in together. So that's the kind of that's the backdrop that I want to set when we head into this Mishnah, because then the question becomes: so when does the idea of a different set of obligations for women and for men come up? Where is that from? And the answer really is the Mishnah. The Torah never has a statement to the effect of women are not obligated in the same ways that men are obligated. Women as a class ought to have these responsibilities or these duties. That the Torah doesn't make those kinds of statements. So when we come upon one in the Mishnah, I think we have to wonder, what is it doing there? What is it meant to do? Why is it there? What is the logic behind it? We are, I think, just my last caveat here, we're not legislating this. I mean, I work and teach in an egalitarian community. So we're not really considering whether one model or another, like as a matter of practice, our community has sort of settled this debate. Nor do I think what we're up to today is to take a look at the law as it was stated and try to figure out whether or not it's just or fair. That can be a part of the conversation, but that's not the conversation that I want. In a sense, I'm presuming that the feminist sensibilities that have affected me have affected most of you, and that we are fairly well convinced by the idea of equal rights for men and women in our society. Judaism is a little complicated in that conversation, in that we don't usually speak in terms of rights, but in terms of obligations. So that's just like, that already gives us a sense that we're having a slightly different conversation. But I want, this is all by way of saying, we're about to talk about a massive thing that we won't possibly do justice to, but let's talk about it. Let's begin to talk about it, because it is important, especially I think in an egalitarian community, to understand what is the justification for non-egalitarian. Where did that idea come from? We ought to, as egalitarian Jews, be armed with that knowledge. Okay, so here we go. So we're going to head in. Any caveats or questions before we head in? And I will say, I'm not generally like the biggest fan of I don't know, sloganizing kind of woke phrases, but I think that trigger warning here is actually it's become a very helpful concept for me as a teacher, because there are some things that one ought to be warned. Like, there are some things in here that are, because they're going to talk about gender and in such a categorizing way, there are texts here that may upset you, and you should at least know that heading in. Okay, and obviously you're welcome to say so. Okay, so let's take a look. I'm going to give you a source sheet here. And we're our context is we're in the first Mishnah. I'm sorry, the first tractate of the Mishnah. We've been going in order of the 6 sections of the Mishnah, and just noting some of the most important or most interesting or coolest Mishnayot as we come across them. And we're only in the 3rd chapter of Brachot. There will be Masechtot, volumes of the Mishnah that we will take only one Mishnah from, but Brachot is jam-packed with it's the first one, and you can feel that the rabbis are excited. They put a lot of the good stuff in Brachot, but as they put a lot of the good stuff in Brachot, one of the things that they come up with along the way is we stumble into this category of women and their obligations. Okay, so the context is that we have been looking at the reading of the Shema, the recitation of the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, which we say twice a day, and that's what we've been talking about so far in the Masechet. When do we say it? When's the exact time we say it? When do we say it at night? When do we say it in the morning? And if you'll recall, last time we met, if you were with us, one of the things we discussed is, well, are there any circumstances under which you don't have to say the Shema? And the Mishnah offered one, which was someone who has just gotten married, right? A chatan, a groom, does not have to say the Shema until he consummates the marriage. And we talked a little bit about why that might be. Maybe but it had something to do with the sex. In other words, was he so nervous that he would not, perform well, that he would not be able to say the Shema, or would be thinking about sex? That's sort of an interesting conversation. But here, chapter 3 picks up on that theme and continues discussing times when you might not be obligated to say the Shema. And again, I'm just reminding us what I just said, which is that language here is going to be framed in terms of your obligations versus when you are not obligated, rather than, okay, let's just leave it there. I think I've already spoken too much. So here's the beginning of the chapter that we're in, which is Mi shemeto mutal lefanav, one who's dead lies before him, someone who has a relative who just died and has not yet been buried, right? That's what the phrase here is exempt. The word is patur, is exempt from the recital of the Shema and from the tefillah, from general prayer, though this probably refers specifically to the Amidah, and from putting on tefillin, the things you wrap around your arms and your head. Okay, so if you have a dead, and this is true, this is law. If someone close to you dies, until that person is buried, you're exempt from reciting the Shema. Now, because this is the context, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I want us to have all of the reference points of information in our conversation. Let's ask the question, why? Why is it so that if someone died close to you and had not been buried yet, you don't have to recite the Shema? Anyone have a thought of why that would be? Joe? Yeah.
I would think at that point they probably would have been concerned about ritual purity because you've got a corpse in front of you, for one thing. In addition to, of course, being distraught by the death of your loved one, obviously.
Okay. You gave us great. So you gave us the an interesting answer, and then the more common answer, which is that the assumption is that you're tarud, you're concerned with other things. Like you don't have the wherewithal, the bandwidth, the focus to say the Shema. Joe, you're right. There could be other factors or considerations, like if you had touched a dead body. But I think the idea that it has nothing to do with your contact, but just that someone you know or were close, someone in your family died, exempts you from saying the Shema is just because you've got more important things on your mind. Okay, that seems like a baseline assumption, and I don't know if it will be relevant to our discussion of women's obligations, but it's out there. It's part of our conversation so far, so we'll keep it in mind. Okay, now let's go back and take a look at this Mishnah, which is the first time in the Mishnah that we encounter this category. Nashim va'avadim v'ktanim. Women, slaves, and minors. Okay, I'm always both uncomfortable with the translation slaves and uncomfortable with the translation servants, because I always say it's somewhere in between. It's not a full-blown slave in the sense that you could do whatever you want to this slave, but it's more than just a servant. It's like an indentured servant. Okay, and minors is kids, someone who's not yet 13. Okay, so this is the category. Nashim va'avadim v'ktanim are exempt, pturin, here's the word here, pturim, mikriyat shema, from the Shema, and putting on tefillin, that wrapping thing, but are obligated for tefillah, mezuzah, and birkat hamazon, the blessing after the meals. So obligated for prayer, for having a mezuzah is really the obligation. You can think of it as kissing the mezuzah, and saying the blessing after the meals. Okay, so we're gonna spend most of our time thinking about what's going on here. Why are they obligated in some things and not in others? But let's first consider the category itself of nashim va'avadim uktanim, because the category comes up enough that we can sit and think a little bit about what is that category? Why are these three groups lumped together in one group? Now let me just, I want to ask you that question, but before I do, let me just explain the two that we're not focusing on today. One, slaves or servants. This is presumably a non-Jewish slave. You can have Hebrew slaves as well, but a non-Jewish slave, someone say captured in war or sold because of economic hardship, and that person is not obligated in the mitzvot, but that person can do a kind of a form of, when that person becomes part of a Hebrew family, that person can perform a kind of pseudo-conversion. They be a kind of immersion in a mikvah, which brings them to a certain level of shared practice, but not all the practices of the family. So in this formulation, it's going to be the same obligations that women and minors have. Okay, so a little technical, but that's the category there. And then kids, that's also an interesting category because kids are also not obligated in any of these things. And so the commentators try to figure out, well, what are kids doing here? And they say, well, kids are not obligated in these things, but it is good to teach kids to keep the mitzvot so they'll be ready when they do, when they become 13. And in that sense, the Mishnah is teaching that you should have kids say the prayers along with you. You should have kids kiss the mezuzah along with you. You should have kids recite Birkat HaMazon even though they're not obligated, but don't have them recite the Shema or put on tefillin until they turn 13. And that also generally fits the practice, okay? Now, having said all this, you may think, why are you giving me all these details about the differences between slaves and kids and all these different, like, the category itself feels a little strained. Like, oh, you're talking about kids, but kids, it's for education, and slaves, it's if they're converting to Judaism, but women, it's just the women, the way they are. Like, the whole lumping here seems strange to me. So let me just open it up a little bit and ask you, like, what is this category? Women, slaves, and children. Let's just try and get a sense of why would that be a category, either given what I've said or some other association that you might bring to it. Any thoughts there? I think Leah's got a thought. Leah, what were you going to say? You want to unmute yourself? Unmute yourself.
I was actually responding to someone who asked a question on that.
Okay, sorry.
But can you ask the question one more time? And I'm probably...
Okay, the question is women, slaves, children. That's a category of people who are exempt from the Shema and from tefillin, but obligated in other things like prayer and Birkat HaMazon and mezuzah. Why those three? What's the three?
Okay, so one thing I could think of is like their mind, like they have other things going on in their life. Like, so like a slave or a servant is dealing with like what their obligations are. A child really can't have the wherewithal yet to kind of deal with that. And then if you look at a woman, if you want to get stereotypical about it, they're busy with the house and don't really have time as much to deal with it. Like, yeah.
Okay, that's a great and we'll come across that reading. Well, that's a great possible reading here, which is that it has to do with you are exempt because there are other things that you have to take care of, right? It would be unreasonable to ask you to also be obligated in these things because you've got other things going on. And as Leah said, that would apply potentially to women. And as Leah was saying, well, you know, if you presume a traditional role that has all kinds of other, you know, obligations, and it might also apply to a house servant. It doesn't actually, that reading though, I think doesn't, you gave us another one for kids, right? Because it doesn't actually fit kids. With kids, you would have a different, though maybe related category of, well, they're just too young. Their mind isn't fully present enough. That was what you said. That wouldn't apply to women and slaves. There would be different, but maybe it has something to do with your level of ability, your availability, in other words, for the commandments, whether your mental availability or just sort of your psychic availability, given all your other, right? Okay, Wendy, you have a reading or a thought?
You know, I think we've studied this kind of thing before in the Mishnah. I think it's related to many things. Women, servants, and minors are not counted. We talk about counting in Torah very much. Taking a census, how we count people, how we identify people in the Torah. People's names are mentioned. Men's names, not women, not minors. Although they'll say so-and-so, bat or ben, you know, son of, daughter of. So these are people also for a minyan. You do not count women or slaves or children, men. And I think it also leads to what we spoke about, we studied a few weeks ago, about talking with women was something that was so trivial and beneath, can take away from you, that there is a level of conversation that you have with a woman that is not at the highest level as if you were speaking with a man.
Okay, great.
So there's a lot of stuff mixed in, I think.
There's a lot of stuff mixed in. You gave us two really strong possibilities. One is that it has to do not with availability, which is in a way, like as that reading, like women are just too busy with other things, has a kind of sympathy for women sort of implicit in it. Though in its context. Whereas there's another very strong possibility, which is it's just about status. It's about who counts. It's about who represents the community, right? Like men are the representatives of the community in any kind of formal, official presentation. And these are just lesser members of the community. They don't either lesser in the sense that they simply are not at the highest levels of the community, or so significantly different that their role is not to serve as a representative of the community. So that's also, I think, one of the very obvious and live possibilities here. Is that has to do with status. And then Wendy sort of threw in another one, but I think it's also important to consider, which is, maybe in the case of women in particular, this has to do with, you know, sexual mores and fear of closeness, or right. Wendy's referencing a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that says don't talk too much to women, right? So maybe it has to do with a very vigilant and intense sexual ethic that keeps men and women separate. And since men are doing it, sorry, women just can't, because we don't, that would lead to mixed dancing, so to speak. Okay? Allison.
I'm not totally sure, but it strikes me that one thing that women, slaves, and children might all have in common is a certain lack of freedom, you know? Like if you are a man in that society, then you, like we talked in your class last week about like intention, right? And so if you have the ability to have like a internal kavanah with yourself, then it makes sense to wrap tefillin and say the Shema because you're affirming something. But if you don't really have ownership over the self, as women, slaves, and children don't, then maybe affirming the Shema is not really as relevant.
Yeah, that is very very beautifully put. That is to say, very elegantly put. That it isn't just a matter of status. I think you're adding to the question of to the status paradigm. But it isn't just a matter of status, like these people have a higher rank in society. Though yes, that's true. It's what status then bestows upon you spiritually, and when I say spiritually, in your language, by way of like of selfhood. Like someone who is completely free is able to express themselves in a full way. And the law then is speaking to someone who is able to really own their religious lives and fully extend themselves spiritually. And someone who is bound either by marriage or parentage or ownership, that person's simply not they're not able to fully express their spiritual being. And so there's a way in which, like, though this is being like imposed upon them, and we might say unjustly so, it also, there is actually a logic to it, a sort of kind of philosophical logic to it, which is that you really do need to be free in order to be able to fully express this religious vision. Now, as I say that, I also want to make reference to something that a lot of academics have said. This is a little out of my ken of knowledge, but that in the Greek context, which is the one that the rabbis might have been most likely to borrow from in thinking about the way societies are ordered, the person who has a vote in society and fully participates in society is a free Greek male, right? So again, free and male and adult, right? So these same like maybe this is a kind of play off those things, in which case that free Greek male is the person, that's the full person in that society. And these other categories are simply not able to be as full in their selfhood. Okay, there's a lot. Yeah, that's deep and devastating. There's a lot there, but I really appreciate that read. All right, Jane.
Okay. Just, I don't know if you covered this already, but the way it seems to be explained in Chabad Hasidus, at least, is that women don't have to participate in time-bound mitzvot. That, of course, I suppose pertains to all their, domestic obligations. But the other thing that they say to rationalize it is that women are inherently more spiritual than men. We have it within us. And so we don't have to get out and do the tefillah or so many of the other things that men have to strive to do to keep up.
Great, thank you. Yes, this is another explanation that I think you will hear, like that this explanation has been developed in Jewish dialogue over time. You'll hear it a lot in certain circles, which is that women don't need the discipline of the commandments. They're already spiritually elevated in some way. And as you said, Jane, this is not the same, but in a way, I think this, if we were going to divide these various readings into kind of two camps, to simplify, but to oversimplify, you have one camp which suggests that there's something about this status which limits women and is on some level demeaning to women. right? Lowers their status or keeps them bound in a certain, and then there's another realm in which the explanations seem to be not sympathetic to women, maybe even admiring. So the idea that women are on a higher spiritual level is not the same as the idea that women have other obligations and can't possibly be expected to also run to synagogue every time it's time to say the Shema. Those aren't the same idea, but they are the same in that they're on that side of, no, these are not unjust laws. On the contrary, they recognize the distinct and laudable and even admirable status of women in society, right? As opposed to the other side, which says, no, there's something about this that inherently sees women as lower and lesser in society. Okay, good. So we have those two possibilities, and we'll continue to explore them. Jane also tells us where we're really going, which is to this very specific category of time-bound positive. We'll get there in a second. That's actually going to be our main, that's going to be the main concept that we reckon with. But before we do, I want to just take a minute to think about the other confusing piece, the other part of this Mishnah, and for me, the more confusing part, which is, what is the difference between the Shema and Tefillin on the one hand, and then prayer, mezuzah, and Birkat Hamazon on the other? Now, in some ways, the cat's already out of the bag. Jane has already said, well, this has something to do with time, and we'll soon get there. In other words, just to give it up a little bit, the Shema and Tefillin are done at certain times of the day, whereas the others are could take place at any time of the day. Okay. Does anyone have any other? I was going to sort of like hold that, but does anyone have any other reading that makes sense of it? What is the difference between Shema, Tefillin on the one hand, and then Tefillah, Mezuzah, and Birkat Hamazon on the other? Does anyone have a notion of what those obligations might indicate and why they might be different? Let's see if I can go back and see anyone else. Because it's fair to say we don't, right? In which case we'll be right away in the subject of today, which is this time-bound question. Alexandra.
Hi. I was thinking that it has to do, and maybe I'm wrong, but it has to do with sovereignty and where you're placing your sovereignty. So, for example, Birkat Hamazon, you're giving thanks for the food, but you're not. But that comes from possibly or directly from the man of the house being the provider, possibly. And the Shema is the sovereignty, you're giving it to God. So I was thinking about where are you placing your sovereignty and who's allowed to place sovereignty where?
Okay. So we could think of, is there something different about the nature of these prayers and where the authority lies in these prayers? It's sovereignty, as you put it. Yeah. Anyone else?
It seems weird to me. I don't really know how to make sense of them, actually. Because it seems like, and Jane just put in the chat that in a lot of ways, tefillah also has time-bound qualities, because you only sort of get credit or whatever, like if you say it by a certain hour or whatever. But I also feel like it seems insulting in a way to me that Shema seems like the core thing. Like that's it. That's being a Jew, is like the Shema. And they're like, no, you don't need to do it. It's too evolved for you. Leave it for the men. But it seems weird that Tefillin gets put in that category with Shema, and then Tefillah, Mezuzah, and Birkat Hamazon. I mean, Birkat Hamazon and Mezuzah to me seem like things that would be much lesser obligations anyway. And maybe that's exactly why they're in that category. But then Tefillah seems like a longer commitment. So if we're concerned about women being busy or slaves being busy and not having time, it seems like Shema is actually a pretty easy obligation to fulfill, and that Tefillah is a much more complicated one. So it kind of, to me, feels like another rationalization for something that didn't actually have the, I don't know that I'm making any sense. I'm I don't have a clear sense of why they're split this way, I guess.
No, I actually, I actually appreciate your confusion, because I think I want us to be in a little bit of confusion right now, because we're soon going to head into this very distinct paradigm that has to do with specific times. And, we've now mentioned it a few times. So if you haven't seen it before, let's get to it, because we're talking ahead of you. But the reason that I'm trying to hold us back before we get there is because it doesn't actually totally make sense that as an explanation. Because first of all, as Hannah's saying, let's think about the time of prayer and of Shema. Is that really what's dividing there's lots of questions we can ask of like how these mitzvot are in one category and these are in another. But it also, I have to say, this idea of a time-bound mitzvah is going to be an idea that is central to the discussion of women's obligations in Judaism, but doesn't really make sense of like the kids and the slaves, and like, so that the Talmud eventually has to say, well, kids have a different reason where it's good to teach them in prayer, but not to teach them in the Shema because they don't really know what they say, like has nothing to do with time. So one possibility, remember, we're in the very beginning of the Mishnah, and one possibility is this is one kind of category that was operative, that like borrowed from notions of, say a free Greek man or some other category. And it's only later that we're going to get to a different category, which is for women. But that is all to say this particular division between the Shema and Tefillin on the one hand, and then prayer, mezuzah, and Birkat Hamazon on the other, it is a little strange. Out of context, it's a little strange. Okay, I see hands up, and I want to take them, and then I want to get into what actually ends up being our main Mishnah of the day. So Nick and then Allison.
I feel like for better or worse, I think that this has a lot to do with these sort of like delineations between men, ostensibly cis men, and then children, slaves, and women has less, the justification has less to do with the quality of each of these different things, whether it's Birkat Hamazon, mezuzah, tefillah, wrapping tefillin, and saying the Shema, and more to do with trying to uphold an existing dynamic of domains within a system where, and not saying that this is something that I align with, I don't, but Birkat Hamazon and the mezuzah, Birkat Hamazon is associated with food making, the mezuzah is associated with the house, and tefillah is kind of somewhere in between. And then tefillin and Shema, are levels of prayer that may take place, let's say, in a shul or in the Beit Knesset or whatever, So that is to say, it seems as if they're splitting these two sort of categories between like women are in the house and men are not in the house. Presumably the children with the women, so they will help them with everything that's going on. And it also seems like a delineation between like, and I don't stand by this, like high thought and low thought with regards to why slaves aren't able to participate in this. It seems like slaves aren't going to have access or should not have access to high thought things that may be tied more to class. So they're then put into this other category. It seems more like a way to justify an existing dynamic as opposed to like really say something meaningful about each of these categories of like tefillah, mezuzah, Birkat Hamazon, etc.
Yeah. Okay, I love both those thoughts. I want to pick up especially on the first paradigm that you offered us, which I think is pretty significant. Leah mentioned at the outset, well, maybe a woman would be expected to be focused on the home. And I think as we move through this, one of the binaries that we can work with is the public and the private. And is it the case that what is happening is that a domain of mitzvot is being sketched out that is going to take place in the public gathering? When you gather together in the public for sort of ceremonial or ritual things, men will leave the house and go do that. And things that, now we could quibble on each one like, oh, well, but can't you say the Shema in the house, right? But your general sense that maybe this is pointing towards mitzvot that are going to take place in the temple, in the Beit Knesset, out in the public square, versus surely those that actually can be done easily in the home, women continue to be obligated by, right? So that's, so I want to hold on to that one because I think it becomes relevant. Allison.
Yeah, so I love what Nick just said, and I think he's really onto something with that. And just to, I guess, reinforce that, I was thinking about
you say, I'm sorry to interrupt. You love what Nick said, public-private, or you love what Nick said, higher thought, lower thought?
The public-private. I actually think that they're connected. I think those are kind of like two aspects of the same thing, right? That maybe something that happens in public is higher in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that's right. And then also, I just wanted to throw out there, like when we think about the mitzvot that are traditionally like women's mitzvot, think like lighting candles, making challah, and the laws around nida, like those are time bound. You know, like when do you light the candles? You light the candles right before Shabbos. Like you have to have the challah ready for Shabbos. That's not time bound. And nida is also specifically time bound.
Great.
Yeah.
So, such a thank you for being that smart, because we are not even at the category. We're about to get there, but that's exactly right. Once we encounter the category where it all has to do with whether things have to happen at a particular time or not, we can start counting off all of the mitzvot that don't work, that actually don't fit that paradigm at all. And then you get into the realm of exceptions. Oh, well, women do have to hear the Megillah, but that's just different because they were also part of that miracle, right? As one of the classics. Like, wait, what? In other words, like, what is this category meant to indicate if there are all kinds of exceptions? Why do we have it at all? Okay, with that said, let's finally get to this category, which really is the central. This is a text that you all should just know. Every Jew should just know this text, whether they're an egalitarian or a non-egalitarian. It's just like good core Jewish knowledge. And it offers this paradigm of mitzvot aseh shehazman grama, the commandment, the positive command, time-bound commandments. Such a mouthful. I wouldn't naturally even think of the category, but that's the category: positive, time-bound commandments. Okay. Now, here's just a transition text, because we're in this a little bit kind of cryptic Mishnah in Brachot that just says these are the three categories, and these are the 5 mitzvot, 2 of them which they are not obligated in, 2 of them which they are. We spent time trying to figure it out, but some of you already knew, and the Talmud, here's the Gemara picking up on the Mishnah, the Talmud seems to already know as well, because immediately the Talmud presumes, wait, why are you saying it in this way? There's an obvious paradigm here. The recitation of Shema is obvious. It's so obvious that women don't say the recitation of the Shema, for it is time-bound. It is a time-bound positive mitzvah, and women are exempt from any time-bound positive mitzvah. Okay, soon we're going to define this a little more, but just time-bound is obvious enough. It takes place at a certain time. Not obvious, as Allison said, we could think about what that means. Positive in the sense that it's a thou shall versus a thou shall not, right? Like you must say the Shema, not do not eat non-kosher food, right? So the Gemara assumes that whatever this Mishnah is saying, you must be talking about another Mishnah. You must be referring to another category that we have, which we'll soon look at. But I can't move forward without noting the Gemara's response. Now, the Gemara says, wait, you just told me that women can't say the Shema, can't is the wrong word, are exempt from saying the Shema because, and I want to suggest that's because it's a time-bound commitment. So then why do you have, the Gemara is going to want to know, why do you have to teach me this? Just wait until we get to that rule about time-bound commitments. And the answer of the Gemara is quite interesting. But you might say, Shema includes the acceptance of the kingdom of heaven. So this, and women are obligated in that. So this comes to teach us otherwise. Now, this is like both a sort of, it's fascinating. There's something about it that's very, there's something about this very kind of like, it's very opening, and then there's something that's immediately closing. That is, the suggestion, the implication here is, when it comes to a major religious obligation, like accepting the kingdom of heaven upon yourself, my assumption would be that men and women both do that. Talk about higher thought, right? The Gemara says, yeah, women and men one would think they would both have obligations to accept God's kingship, right? But, right, here's the closing, the disappointing. But no, actually, surprise, surprise, women are not obligated in this, even though you might assume that they are. So I want you to see that there's, even in the language of the Gemara, there's a little bit of a they're confused too. Wait a minute, Shema is such a major thing. What, are women not supposed to accept the kingship of heaven? And then the answer is nope. They because of this other reason they don't. So just note that that's there. I feel like a little bit of a tangent I took you on, but to me it feels very important. Okay, here's the Mishnah that we're going to be looking at then. When the Gemara says the recitation of Shema is not obligated, that's obvious because of this time-bound positive mitzvah that women exempt for. That's referring to another Mishnah way over in the third order of the Mishnah in Masechet Kiddushin. And here's I've bolded it because this is a very important and classic formulation that we will spend the rest of our time trying to figure out. For all positive, kol mitzvot aseh, for all positive time-bound commandments, men are obligated and women are exempt. But all positive non-time-bound commandments, both men and women are obligated, and all negative commandments, whether time-bound or not time-bound, both men and women are obligated. Okay, there you have it. That is the first statement, clear statement of categories of obligation that are different for men and women. Okay, so we call this the origins of non-egalitarian Judaism. Here's the origin right here, right? Now, that is to say, a traditionalist might see this as originating in the Oral Torah and therefore originating in God. But as far as we encounter it, this is the first category of difference really explicitly stated between men and women. So let's figure it out. What are these categories? Oh, and I should just finish the Mishnah, and because it's important, it says, except for all negative commandments, except for the prohibition against rounding the corners of the head, like growing out hair here, or shaving the beard, right? Or laws that have to do with a priest. In other words, things that actually are biologically determinate, those women are not obligated in, maybe because they just couldn't, because they don't grow beards, or some of the Talmudic commentaries say, no, even if a woman grew a beard, she wouldn't be obligated, she could cut it in a way that a man would not be allowed to, because that mitzvah is a man's mitzvah, even if a woman could perform it. Okay, you understand that? But let's spend time now with this bolded piece. Positive time-bound commandments, men obligated, women exempt. Positive non-time-bound commandments, men and women obligated. Negative commandments, men and women obligated. So let's just map those out. What is a positive time-bound commandment? Give me some examples.
Tefillin.
Tefillin. Why?
Why is it time bound?
Yeah.
Because you have to put it on at a specific time when you're davening in the morning.
Yeah, and so in particular, you put it on during the day and not the night. It only is recited at a specific period of time. You actually could put it on in the afternoon. Like it first appears to be, well, I put on my tefillin in the morning, so it's a morning commandment. But actually, it's a little broader, but still, it's to be done during the day and not the evening. Okay, so that's one. Others. So we already know another one, right? Shema. Why Shema? Because Shema has very specific times. Has to be recited in the morning and the evening. Leah, you have other.
I was just thinking about in general, like davening, let's say Ma'ariv, and being a shliach tzibur, like in the person who actually fulfills the obligation by doing the prayers, and how you can't do that. So, good. Yeah. So there are two really major areas of law that would then be
non-obligatory to women. One would be prayer laws, anything that had to do with fixed times of prayer. And the other one, the other major category, anyone? Sort of related. Not the daily cycle, or but the yearly cycle. Holidays. All holiday mitzvot are a particular time. They have to be done on a particular day. So that's on the one hand very specific, but on the other hand a very massive area of Jewish law that suddenly women would not be obligated in. And I must say that this fits into the paradigm that Nicholas was suggesting earlier, right? All things that would take place, the ritual public performances, men would carry out public life and women would be back in the private space, right? So that's one way of thinking about it. Okay, positive, time-bound. Now, what about mitzvot that are positive but not time-bound? What are mitzvot that are positive but not time-bound? Like you have to do them, thou shalt, but it doesn't matter when you do them or there's no specific time to do them. Anyone think of one of those? I'll give you a hint. Some of the 10 commandments fit into that category.
Honor your mother and father.
Honor your mother and father is a great one. You have to do that at all times, not just certain times. Others? Actually, the first one, right, which we don't think of often as a commandment. I am the Lord your God. Fear God, love God. All those things, like things that one has to just do at all times. Those are women are obligated in those as much as men are. Okay. And then finally, a negative commandment, whether time-bound or not. What are negative commandments? This is an easy category. Thou shalt not
kill.
Kill. Thou shalt not steal. Right. We're in the 10 commandments, but also thou shalt not eat pork. Thou shalt not violate the Sabbath. All the things that you have to refrain from. Right? Women are obligated in that refraining. Right. So it really is a raw deal for women. Right. Like do not obligated in the active things, but all the things that you don't get to do. Right. I don't mean to be lighthearted about this, but just to follow the funny thought through, like women can eat treif because they're women. They're not obligated in the commandment. Can you imagine a system where like women actually didn't have to keep any of the commandments? Women can kill people, right? Like that, right? So it doesn't make sense. And so there's a way in which these tiers have some logic to them. But now we have to ask the question, like, what's this category? What's going on here? Are people convinced by what Nick was suggesting, that this is about public versus private, or are there other ways of thinking about how it is? I'll put it back on screen. Why is it that positive time-bound commitments women are exempt from? Any thoughts around that? Yes, Alexandra.
I see this as pretty nefarious along with the Shema regulations. Anything that's time-bound is gonna interrupt the flow of daily life, might interrupt someone's like a man's comfort, and might interrupt when his dinner arrives. So to me, this is pretty disturbing. I'm grateful to be learning it, and I'm glad that I'm learning it now as opposed to back then.
Okay, great. So that's I thank you for that spin, because it's important to see that we said this earlier in a way, which is that women should not be taken away from all of the things they would generally be expected to do, but we said it as if it were, and is sometimes, I hear someone's sound. Whose sound am I hearing? Who's unmuted? I hear. No one. Okay. We said earlier that women it might be unfair to pull women away. They've got this whole sphere of life, which was so normative, where they've been running an entire household, so that it wouldn't be reasonable to expect them they would also have to run off to the temple but as Alexandra is saying with men writing this, it sounds actually much more like, we don't want you women to not get your wifely duties done, so stay at home and do them, right? It's not so that women aren't overburdened, but actually so that men make sure that the women take care of all the things that they're not doing while they're out in the world. Okay, great. Wendy?
I find this all, you know, rather disturbing, honestly. I think that this is also a way of keeping women away, shut away, subservient. You're not part of the public. There's no chance really for a woman then to be a part of things that are counted. This is all about counting. What we do, our actions are important. This is paramount throughout Judaism, but yet these positive actions are not something that women are even, they're not to be a part of. They're not to be a part of. Mm-hmm. And I think there are lots of, you know, when we talked even about the time, there are absolute time-bound mitzvot that are connected to women. You know, we've spoken about them earlier, Allison talked about them, you know. And so it's as if, you know, men are writing this, men are finding, how do we keep this our domain? This is our domain.
And can I ask you, Wendy, how then, just extend that thought a little further, how do you, why did they, the authors of this Mishnah, why did they say, oh, women are obligated in the other things? Like the negative commandments, you kind of see, like, it doesn't make sense to say women can eat treif or kill people. But positive non-time-bound commitments, why not just say women are not obligated in positive? Why connect it to time? Anyone else?
I think, well, I think that part of it is that how valued is a woman's time? How a woman spends her time. Mm-hmm. And I think that how we spend our time is defines how we are in the world. Yeah. And the world that the woman is to be a part of is the world inside the home, where there's a different kind of marking of time within, that's her, right? That's her domain, basically.
Okay, great. Okay, so as I predicted, Nick's suggestions were quite fruitful, right? It seems like this division between the public and the private, there's a lot that we can do with that. Does anybody want to continue to build on that or offer any other thought on the distinct? Yeah, Pam. Pam, I'm not hearing you, and you look a little frozen, actually. Okay, Pam, I'm going to come back to you. Okay, Hannah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, but I
guess one more thing, and I
you know what my best guess is that there's something wrong with Pam's.
Yeah, it's feedback.
Delay. Yeah, that's my guess right now. I think we're hearing a distorted version of Pam's thoughts. I'm sure they're quite brilliant, but we can't make them out. Okay, Hannah, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, I just think often about what does it mean to exist in a tradition created by people who didn't really think of other groups of people outside of themselves, right? So we have a tradition created by men who occupied certain roles in their communities and in their lives. And we see some exceptions in text in the past of women who did study, of women who did these things that were maybe not what was expected. I think I've been thinking a lot lately about Yalta, this woman in the Talmud who went against what was expected of her and made a spectacle about it, as she should. But those are really, those are so not the norm of the stories that we know. And I can't help but feel like, we've only had women rabbis in any movement for 40 years. And so I think about how much the world has changed and evolved in 40 years. And I really want to believe, and I do believe actually, that in a lot of ways, these men who created this tradition in this moment thought they were doing women a favor, because the way that they saw it was that there were two things, men and women, which now we also don't really think is the way the world is. And men did this and women did this, and they needed women to make sure that they kept all the plates spinning at home so that the men could have this life outside of the home. And I believe deeply, and maybe this is naive, but I really believe that if these rabbis showed up in 2020, they would believe deeply that we're all the same thing. And that women should be just as obligated as men, and that non-binary people should be just as obligated as men, and that we all have the same rights and we all have the same obligations because we're all full human beings. And I think that they were of their time and of their moment, and they were radical in lots of ways that other traditions at the time weren't. And it was such a different world. And I believe really deeply that they were doing what they had with the information that they had, and that now they would see it the way we see it.
Great. You said so much brilliant stuff there. I won't repeat it all, but I want to just, as we close, I want to just note that as we were heading into this discussion, we had kind of two general fields of analysis. One was more sympathetic to women, like women are on a higher spiritual level, or poor women, they have so much to do, they can't be distracted with this. And then another realm that was less sympathetic to women, like women are lower, women are lesser, women don't belong in the public sphere. And now, in a sense, we've got two versions. Like, I think a lot of people were convinced by the path that that Nick began to pave for us, where there's a kind of there's a public life and there's a private life, and men occupy the public role, and and in doing so they have a particular kind of status, but there is a way in which we can read even that distinction sympathetically, or not, like, that is to say, it could be, as Hannah just put it, a favor to women, not to over obligate them, or it could be a way of keeping and protecting that public status for themselves as a kind of a power move. So we can see that, like, even within a certain logic, there are different ways of imagining the thing that we don't actually have full access to, which is intention. I do have to close, even though I see hands up, and I'll stay on and discuss. But I want to just, before we all hop up, just do one last thing, which is on the note that that Hannah sounded to the recent development of women rabbis. I just want to say that one thing in this whole discussion, which I mentioned at the outset, which I think is, like, worth us turning over and thinking about, is why it is that women were released from the obligation rather than prohibited to do these things, right? It would have been easy for the writers of the Mishnah to say, Nashim asurot b'kriyat shema. Women are not allowed to do these things. They're allowed to do other things. They're only allowed to do these things. They're not allowed to do other things, right? I want us meditating on that, and just to kind of leapfrog that thought into the present. When the conservative movement went through legal argumentation to permit women to become rabbis, one of the things that they said was women are not obligated in the full obligations of the mitzvot, but, and here's Rabbi Joel Roth, in the sort of leading legal thinker in the conservative world, who says women may be counted in a minyan or service as the prayer, there's Wendy's word, counted, as the prayer leader only when they have accepted upon themselves the voluntary obligation to pray as required by the law, and at the times required by the law. In other words, according to Rabbi Roth, and the logic seems to bear itself out easily from the early sources, women are not obligated, but they're not forbidden from doing these things. And so he says they can take upon themselves the obligation. There's nothing that stops women from saying Shema, from putting on tefillin, and eventually from becoming rabbis. So just, like I said, we only really scratched the surface of a very massive and important topic today, but important that we get some of the key constructs that we work with, and also just as we leave, just to sit and think about the language that the Mishnah in general uses to think of behavior as obligation rather than rights, and what that leaves open when the Mishnah could have easily said forbidden and permitted. Okay. that's the class. I'll stay on if people have other questions or want to just, yeah, Nick.
Yeah, I just want to say, Hannah, the way that you framed it is really brilliant and helps reconcile something for me as well. To think that sort of the idea that like they were doing the best with the conditions at the time, and it did, you know, compared like within the context and comparative to the other societies around them, it was progressive, right? To our eyes now it's not, but in the moment it was. And it makes me think about how I was, the other day I was trying to get through the responsa about the conservative responsa about LGBT people, and actually really more specifically gay and lesbian and bisexual people within the conservative movement. And while I had a really, really hard time getting through it as a gay man because it just made me so angry in many ways, I also had to recognize that like here were rabbis who were trying to do their best to build sort of like an arm of inclusion within the conservative movement. And while I don't necessarily agree with everything that they said or the decisions that they came to, I recognize that they were trying. That doesn't change the fact that like there's a lot of stuff in that document that really, 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 really bothered me, but I get that they're trying to do the best with what they have right now, you know? So, Hannah, I think that the way you framed it really, really helped tie that up for me. And I just appreciate that because it was a kind of a loose end.
Thanks, Nick. Jane? Can't hear you.
Sorry. This kind of goes back to what Hannah was saying, you know, in terms of she kind of felt that maybe men thought that they were protecting women. And we've gone to other classes, maybe some of your own, where they talk about the culture of what was going on outside in the streets of Jerusalem at the time, perhaps. You know, lots of criminals, roving bands of marauders or rapists and whatnot, you know, so, you know, file that one under men might have thought they were protecting women, you know, by keeping them domestically and so forth. Now, sort of on another note, you know, sometimes I just chalk all this stuff up to hashgacha pratit. You know, maybe these terrible things that were happening at the time all led up to the revolution that we now have today. Maybe progressive synagogues like ours that we love so much wouldn't exist if it were not for these prohibitions in the past. Who can forget when Sharon Brous said in her origin story about how when she was on an Israel trip with Aish or at the Aish in Jerusalem, when some rabbi spoke and she loved it and she was so inspired and she said, "I want to be a rabbi," you know, to which the woman kind of in charge said, "You don't have to be a rabbi, but you can be a Rebbitzin. You can be a rabbi's wife." And she said, "I don't want to be a rabbi's wife," you know? So,
right.
That.
Right. Allison?
Hey, yeah, I found this conversation really valuable, but I just have a question about the premise. Because at the beginning of today's class, Rabbi, you started out by suggesting that the Torah itself is fairly egalitarian, and then it's kind of like in the rabbinic period that we started to see this like non-egalitarian Judaism. But I haven't really read very much Talmud, to be honest, but I do read the Torah portions every week, and it doesn't read as egalitarian to me. Like, there are so many examples, I don't even know which one I want to pick. I mean, like I could think of at the beginning of Exodus, when we crossed the Red Sea, and then, you know, Rabbi Brous even gave this whole drash this year about that Moses goes up to talk to Hashem, and then Hashem says, "Tell the people," and Moses comes down and speaks only to the men. Like, Rabbi Brous talked about that a couple weeks ago. Like, I was just looking at I have like my Tanakh here, and like a couple weeks ago in Bamidbar, there's all this stuff like the law of the jealousies, how a man can basically accuse his wife of having cheated on him, and there's like a whole process. I don't know, it just doesn't seem...
Let me respond to that, because I may have been a little too quick and imprecise in the way that maybe an irresponsible thing to say, given that the Torah has all kinds of designations and distinctions based on gender and sex, right?
Right.
And it presumes, the Torah seems to presume that men are in charge in this society and often speaks directly to men. All those things are true. What I meant when I said the Torah defaults to egalitarianism was a bit anachronistic, which is to say egalitarianism has come to mean men and women having equal obligations under the law as a general principle. And all I meant to say is the Torah doesn't seem to presume otherwise, except in a particular law that would apply only to men or to women, right? So
I see.
So like when the law is gendered, then clearly, and the Torah may be what we today would call sexist or patriarchal, but I just mean that the Torah is egalitarian in the sense that it doesn't introduce a notion in the way that we use the terms egalitarian or non-egalitarian. It doesn't introduce a notion that women have a lesser set of obligations than men. That kind of language, that kind of talk is language that really only emerges in the rabbinic period. So I offer that not to say, well, the Torah is a perfectly like modern and feminist document, but to say that there is a lot of room in the vision of Judaism that the Torah presents us to think about very different ways that men and women's roles and obligations might have played out. And I think that the idea that egalitarianism is not, part of the reason that I say that is because it is possible to imagine that egalitarianism as a modern movement is not a departure from the past, but a kind of a return to a past before the formulations of the Mishnah. And that's kind of what I meant. But you're right that it would be a little glib to say like the Torah is a perfectly egalitarian document, right?
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I think we have to stop here. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow or soon.